Hey folks, welcome back. This is Chris with Alpenglow Digital, and in today's video, we are going to wrap up your very first Power App. You may notice this form looks a little bit nicer than at the end of the last video. Still not beautiful, but hopefully a little bit nicer. We're going to talk about how to add a header to your form, how to add an icon if you'd like. We're going to touch a little bit on themes and how you can easily apply those to your Power App if you want some quick and easy styles right out of the box. We're going to talk about required fields, how to make them explicitly required or conditionally required. For this example, we have a type of event that is a wedding, and when a wedding is chosen, the dress code becomes required. But if something else is chosen, the dress code is not required. We are also going to talk about how to send a user to a success page once they've correctly submitted your form. So here's an example. Again, not that pretty. We're also going to talk about how you can send them back to a screen if you want them to be able to submit multiple requests. So without further ado, let's go. Welcome back in, folks. Here is our form like we left it in part 1. It's got a few simple SharePoint list fields and a submit button. It's all hooked up. It works, but it's certainly not pretty. So we're going to do a couple things to spruce it up and try and make this a better experience for our users. So the first thing I want to do is add some sort of header to this form. So when folks land here, if somebody gives them a link, for example, they know exactly what they're doing and what the form is meant to capture. There are a couple ways we could do this. We could, if we wanted to, add another custom card in the same way we did for the submit button. This would be part of the form. The downside to doing that for something like a header is that if this form were super long and you were to scroll, the header would get lost and go off the screen. It's not statically placed within the Power App. So typically for headers, I don't like to use custom cards. And instead, what I like to do is just add it as an independent component kind of at the top of the page. So I have my form here that's full height at the moment. I'm just going to drag it down a little bit and give us some space up here at the top for a header. Now, if you go here to insert, you can see the different widgets we can add to our Power App. What I would recommend doing is if you anticipate this having several components. So in my case, I want to add a header, which is text, and then I'm going to add like an icon to spruce it up even further. So if you are going to have multiple components, I would recommend using a container. If you search for container, you'll see a couple options here. I'm going to add the container by just dragging it over. And the container acts as a way to wrap multiple elements. Just like a custom card, if you add widgets within here or components, you will kind of scope them, if you will, inside this container. Just like in traditional web development, you might have like a parent div wrapper, for example, and like a header and a button inside of it. This is kind of sets up a parent-child relationship with the components within inside it. So now that I have that container, I can either click this button, kind of get the same menu I did before, and I want to add a text label here. And my text label is going to be our header. And we're going to say request event planning assistance. And I'm going to drag it to make it a little bit wider. And then let's just do some basic styling. So if this is going to be our header, we do want it to be a little bit larger. It's defaulted to 13. I'm going to make it 24 font over here on the right. And you'll see that this doesn't resize kind of the area that it allows you to put that within. We'll touch that in a second. I'm going to change it from Open Sans to Segoe. And one of the things that is helpful to do, so you're not always adjusting the height yourself, is if you turn auto height on, this will make the height of your text label fit the content that's inside of it. So I can drag this up a little bit now. And now it's the correct height. I'm actually just wanting it on one line, so I am going to drag it a little bit wider. It'd be cool if they had an auto width. They may in future releases. So now that I have my text here, I'm going to place it kind of here on the left. And then also within here, I'm going to add an icon. So I'll go here, let's see, like a calendar icon. So really quick, instead of searching for things, Power Apps does split things up kind of by section. So they have a list of popular widgets here, and then further down you can see different inputs and display elements and layout things, which is where we found kind of our container down here. And then they have a little icon gallery down here too. And if you search, it will search all of these different sections. So in my case, I just want a calendar. Let's add that. And let's just put that over here on the right-hand side. So you can see there are kind of helpers that will allow you to align things more easily. I want this container to be a darker color, and then maybe we'll have white text. So over here on the right, while I have the container itself selected, I'm going to change the color. And let's do like a dark gray. Okay. And with that dark gray background, we now need to adjust our text color. So I'm going to click on the text label, scroll over here to the right under the display properties, and you'll see two options for color. A lot of elements have two options. The first in this case is our text color. The second is our background color. I believe background defaults to transparent, which works great since our container already has a background. So I'm going to change the font color to white. That sticks out nicely. And I'm going to select the icon. Also the same two options here. In this case, it's not quite font color, if you will. It's more icon color. And I will change that to white. That looks much better. Now that we have a nice header and an icon, I want to make the background of this form a little bit flashier. Not too flashy, because I really want to ensure that folks can focus on the fields that they're trying to input data for and not get too distracted by the background, but I think plain white is a little bit boring. So on the left here, if you have your screen selected, you can see a few properties that you can adjust for the screen. Not a ton, not nearly as many as you can for particular widgets, but one of the options is to add a background image. You can either upload something you have on your computer, or you can search the stock images. You do want to be mindful again of choosing something that's a little bit too busy. This image, for example, really makes it difficult to see the labels for your form. And the last thing you want to do is make your form difficult to use. So instead of that image, I like to search for patterns, which will give me plainer images, if you will. This one seems fine. Let's add that. Okay, not too offensive. Adds a little bit of personality, if you will, to the form. By default, the background image is going to be set to fit, which means it will contain it at the height or width level. So in this case, it's full height, but not full width. I want it to fill the whole screen, so I'm going to choose fill. Fill will keep the same aspect ratio. It'll just expand it. If you were to stretch it, it would stretch it to full height and width, but it would distort the aspect ratio. Not a huge deal when you have a pattern like this because nobody really knows what it's supposed to look like, but I'm going to keep it as fill. You can see it's slightly taller. And this way folks can still read my form, adds a little bit of personality to it. I think that's a good start. In a moment here, we're going to dive into updating some of the styles within our cards, within our form. But briefly, I want to touch on themes. So at the top, if you have the screen selected, you will see the theme dropdown. And the theme dictates your kind of default styles for your form and for other elements within your Power App, if you will. You can see these have kind of a blue title, border, little icon background, and our button is blue. This is because we have the blue theme selected, which I think is the default for most Power Apps. If you wanted something like the SharePoint green, you could do a light color, and there are a bunch of other Office related themes down here if you like. And if you have a background image on our screen, which we do already, if you were to select something like Rose, which has a dark background typically, that gets kind of overridden by your background image. So technically behind this background image, there is a darker screen, but we don't have that now since we have a background image. So for right now, we're going to keep this as blue, and then we are going to go through and update things manually ourselves. But themes are great if you just want something quick and easy out of the box, don't want to spend a lot of time styling. Choose a theme that matches your use case or vibe and go that way. Now, with Power Apps, as with traditional development, if you will, there are a number of ways to accomplish essentially the same thing. So in our case, I do want these labels to all be the same color, and I don't love this darker blue. I kind of want them to be a dark gray. That's a personal preference on my part. So if you were to click into the card and then click into the label, it's actually called a data card key because it is part of a form element. Come over here to the right, you see all of the typical design properties that you'd expect: the font, font size, font weight. Down here, you've got things like color and background color if you want to add borders and the like. You could come into each card and adjust each label the way you wanted it. The downside to doing that is that if you went back later and decided, oh, I don't love dark gray anymore, maybe I want it to be dark green, you would have to come into each card, each label, and adjust things that way. So instead, what I would recommend doing is setting up a variable within Power Apps that will hold a color value. And then for each label, we will make the color value reference that variable value. So then if you wanted to make an adjustment in the future, all you would need to do is go to that variable, say, hey, instead of dark gray, I want it to be dark blue or dark green. And then all of your elements would adjust accordingly because they're all referencing the variable value. So let's talk a little bit about how to set that up. There are a number of ways that you can declare and change variables. You can attach them to screens, to the app itself, to buttons. Maybe when a button is clicked, you start a loading icon, and then once a certain period of time has passed, you stop the loading icon, things like that. Variables in Power Apps really make this a very powerful tool. And this is maybe a slightly more intermediate topic, but I do think it has a great use case here in our first forum. So I just want to touch briefly on it. So what we are going to do is declare some variables at the app level. So this is when somebody loads your application for the first time. If you click the app button over here, or area if you will, you can go to the on start property. And here you can write some logic that will trigger as soon as this app is loaded. And so what we want to do is declare a variable that will hold a value for our font color. And then we're going to update all of our fields to reference that variable and thus that font color, and they will all be the same. So the set property is how you would declare a global variable. In a future video, we'll talk more about kind of local variables and global variables within Power Apps. You do want to use global variables sparingly if you anticipate having a big, complicated app, because the global variables are shared across screens, and it can get a little bit messy if you are trying to use or update variables that have similar names, and you create a workflow that becomes a little bit complicated. In that case, you may want to use local variables, but for now, we're going to use a global variable because our application is going to be simple. This is going to be called the field label color, we'll call this. Again, this is any name you want, just like you're declaring a variable in another programming language. And then we are going to pass it a value. In this case, it needs to be a color value. And so we're going to use RGBA, so red, green, blue, and alpha. I think the color I remember liking was 51, 51, and 100. And it should be a gray color. So we'll check in a second if that is true. So we've declared our variable. And now that we have a variable named field label color, we want our actual label within this card to reference that. So I'm going to click on the label. I'm going to come over here on the right where we have color, and I'm going to click color so that it becomes the property that we are editing up here. And here's the default color it gave us, which is kind of that blue, which makes sense because that's what our theme is. I'm going to drag this down to give us a little bit more space. If you ever want to comment something out, you can just lead with 2 slashes, and now this value will not be read. It's a great way to leave comments for folks if you wanted to. So in this case, maybe we'll say referencing color via variable. And now if somebody, like a team member who is maybe not as well versed in Power Apps, comes and they see a name instead of a color, they can be like, what are you talking about? And this is just a quick way to help give them some context. So it's funny that I must have some sort of AI or Copilot thing enabled because it's already telling me, hey, I think you want to use a variable here, which I do. So I just press enter, field label color. So now this is what we are using instead of the previous color, which is the RGB code. And you can see that this has already started to change a little bit. I actually don't think this is our color because this value or this variable is not set until the application starts. and technically we haven't restarted our application. So if you click app and click run on start, this will simulate as a user accessing your app for the first time. So I actually think this got a little bit darker. So this is the correct color, which is great. And we are going to do the same thing for the font weight. I want this to be bold because I think bold looks better for our labels. So back up and on start for the app. I'm going to use a semicolon, which tells Power Apps, hey, we're done with this line. We're going to add something else now. We are going to do another set variable function, field label font weight is what we're going to call this. And then the value we want to pass this is a string, and it is bold. So now I'm going to go back into my card, click on my label again. Again, this has color. And on the right here, I'm going to go to font weight. I'm going to click that so it becomes the property that we are referencing. Instead of normal, we are going to reference it with our variable. Font weight bold. Well, it will be bold. Now, you'll notice again that this didn't change. And so if we run the onStart property again, you will see that this triggered. It's now the right color and the right font weight based on the two variables that we added here. So we will apply this to the rest of our form. We'll just do another one really quickly for the description. I'm going to change the color. I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to do a field label color and font weight. I'm going to backspace out of that and do font weight. And now you can see those starting to take shape, and I think it looks much better. So we're going to burn through the rest of these. All right, now we've got our font colors and font weight styles applied to all of our fields. We're about to dive into how to make fields required, but before we do that, I want to cover a scenario that you may find yourself in quite often as you're building forms and using lists. The scenario is you've created a SharePoint list, you've attached it to Power Apps, and then you realize that you need to add another field to your list and therefore your form. And I think that in the background, Power Apps must do some sort of connection refresh automatically, because sometimes when you go into your form and you go to add fields, maybe that you've just added to SharePoint, you will see the fields there as an option when you click add field, but sometimes you won't. And so if you have just recently added a column, I, for example, added the dress code column to my SharePoint list recently, and I'm going to go back and manually refresh the data connection between Power Apps and SharePoint. So on the left here, you'll see the data tab. This has our existing SharePoint connection. And I'm just going to click the three little dots here and click refresh. And so this is going to tell Power Apps, hey, you need to go grab the latest fields, values, things like that from your SharePoint list. And then they will be available here in Power Apps to use them. So back in Tree View, I have my form selected. You can either, again, edit fields over here on the right or at the top of your screen when the form is selected. And I'm going to add the new field, which was dress code. And there it is. That will automatically add it to the bottom of my form. And we are going to adjust where this is positioned because I think this should be after type of event, not at the back. So again, I can either drag the little icon here and move it up, or if you have the form selected, you go to your fields. You can also move fields up and down this way. So you see that change. If I move it up here, then it flows in after type of event. So now that we have this new field here, we are going to do the same thing where we're going to change the font weight. Let's see, font weight instead of normal, we're going to do field font weight. And instead of color, we are going to use our variable as well. All right. That looks good. Now on to required fields. Before we get to the point where we want users to go to our secondary screen, our success screen, we want to make sure that they are providing us with the correct fields. And so what we need to do firstly is ensure that anything we want to have required is required in Power Apps. There are a couple ways to make fields required. The first way you could do it is within SharePoint. Here's our list settings. As you can see, none of these are required. There'd be a check mark if they were. And If you know that you are going to use all of these fields and they're all going to be required every time, you could make these required in SharePoint and then also make that update in Power Apps. But what I prefer to do is make as few things as possible required in SharePoint and do the requiring, if you will, on the Power App side. This is because you might create different versions of this form, and not every time it'll have the same fields, and those fields might not be required based on other inputs. And so you can add some conditional logic to the required property of each field. And I like to handle all of that within Power Apps. So let's do a couple easy ones, and then let's talk about a conditional required property. So firstly, event title. Seems like something pretty basic. We probably want that to be a required field. So if you click the card, come over here to the advanced pane, you will see a bunch of properties about this field in SharePoint. You'll also see some design things. These are unlocked because you can edit them from the display pane, but there are a lot of ones that are locked. And required is one of those fields that is locked. And if you click unlock to change properties, you will see that these are unlocked now, and so we can make changes. This is just one way to make sure you don't accidentally screw with these properties if you're not meaning to. In our case, we do want to adjust the required field, or the required property, pardon me. So in this case, required is set to false, and we want this to be true because every request we get should have an event title. I think that makes sense. So if we select required, we have it be our active property. We can set it to true. Again, this needs to resolve whatever you put in here, whether it's true or false or some sort of formula. It needs to then resolve to true or false so that Power Apps knows either yes, this is required, or no, it's not. So when we change this from false to true, you can see it added a little asterisk next to it for us, which is great. Some sort of visual indication to a user that this is a required field. What I like to do is style the asterisk a little bit. I want to make it red. I want to change the X property, which is the horizontal property. I want to make it 10 so it moves it over to the right a little bit. And now it hugs the label a little bit better, makes it kind of clear that, hey, you need to ensure that this has data in it before you submit. And maybe the description's not as important. Date and time seems like something that's important. So again, we're going to go over here, unlock. We're going to click required, make that the active property, change it to true. Do the same thing here where we're going to move it over 10 pixels, and we are going to have it be red. Let's talk about something that's a little bit more complicated, and that is using some sort of formula or condition to determine whether a field should be required or not. So if I play our app, just to let us preview this a little bit better, we have 3 types of events. And we also have a dress code. So say if a user selects this as a wedding, I do want them to then tell us what the dress code is. So I want to make dress code required if the type of event is a wedding. If it's an anniversary or a birthday, then I don't care what the dress code is. So what we want to do then is for the dress code card, it's not going to be true or false explicitly. It's going to have a statement tied to it, an if statement specifically. So if we select required, we are going to add an if statement, just like Excel or other traditional programming language. We're going to give it something it's going to resolve to either true or false, and then it's going to do something based on whether that statement is true or false. So in this case, we want to look at this specific dropdown and see what the value of it is. This is called data card value 3, which was one of the default names given to it. And so if I click back to this card, back to required, I want to check if the data card value 3 dot selected dot value. This is saying the selected value or text of this input, I want this to be something. If it equals wedding, then I want this to be required. If it doesn't equal wedding, this does not have to be required or false. So let's walk through this again. So what this is saying is I'm going to watch data card value 3, this specifically. If someone selects wedding, then this expression resolves to true, which means that this is the value of required. True, therefore it will have an asterisk and be required. If this expression resolves to false, then we use the false argument, which says required is false. Therefore, it won't have an asterisk and will not be required when somebody submits a form. So let's just play around with it. So if I select wedding, you'll see that this then becomes required. And if I select anniversary instead, that is no longer required. Same with birthday party. And so just to make things look pretty, we're going to select wedding, and we are going to make this asterisk look a little bit prettier. And now we have some conditional logic set up to ensure that if somebody selects a wedding, we do need to capture the dress code. And if they did not provide that, then the form would show an error. Now that we have our required logic all set up, this will help ensure that folks only submit good data to us. And it's finally time to add a second screen, which will be our success screen. And we will take folks there once they have submitted the form, if it is submitted successfully. So let's firstly add the screen, and then we'll add the logic to get to the screen. I collapsed my screen over here to give us a little bit more room, and I'm going to select new screen. Just like other things in Power Apps, there's usually a blank option and then a lot of cool templates. In our case, Power Apps already knows that a common scenario is you need a success screen. So we are going to choose that. And it will give us a new screen, in this case, screen 2, with a little bit of boilerplate. In our case, this was successfully completed, and a little icon with a check mark. So we're going to change the icon. Maybe let's make this green. That seems like a better success color. Great. So how do we get to this screen? Well, if I'm a user, I only want to be navigated to that screen if I have submitted my form correctly. If I'm missing data, I don't want to be taken there, because then I think, all right, we're good to go. And in reality, nothing's actually submitted because it's missing data. So instead of adding the navigate property, or function, if you will, to the select button, the onSelect property of the button, we are going to add it to the form itself. So the form has a couple cool properties. So if we select the form and then go over to advanced, we have some action properties, one of which is on success. So if I click that to make it active, right now it's set to false, so nothing happens. This gets triggered when the form is submitted and it is submitted successfully. So if you're missing values, this will not get triggered. And in our case, we do want this to get triggered when the form is submitted successfully, and we want to send the user to our second screen. So really quickly, to make things easy, let's rename our screens. It's a good rule of thumb to, especially if you're working with a team, to name your elements in a way that makes sense. So in our case, this is the screen that's the home screen. This one is the success screen. Again, this will make things much easier when you're writing formulas, or when a team member is accessing this and they didn't build it from scratch. It's an easy way to figure out what's each screen referring to. You could go as far as labeling each container, or each form, each field, and things like that, but we're going to keep things simple. So back here in our form, on success, we are going to use the navigate function. And the navigate function only requires one parameter, and it is the field name where you want to send folks. So in our case, we want to send folks to the success screen. Now there is an optional parameter which I like to provide, and it is called screen transition. And this adds a little bit of animation between the screens as somebody is moving between them. So I'm going to use screen transition.cover. We will take a look at that in a second. And so now that is set up, no errors. So let's give it a shot. This is going to be a test wedding, and we are going to say super awesome wedding. And let's pick a date, since that is required. Tomorrow, it's 11 o'clock. It's a wedding, it's casual, and there's going to be 45 people there. Let's hit submit. You'll see a thing for a second, and then we are taken to our success screen. So at the moment, we don't have a way to get the user back to the other screen, but we have successfully, no pun intended, sent them to the success screen. So let's add a button that allows somebody to go back and resubmit another request, or I should say submit another request. We don't want them to resubmit the same request. We are going to use largely the same logic that we used on the onSuccess property to get us here. In this case, I'm going to add a button, change the text to submit another request. Let's make this look pretty enough so that users can read it. Okay, it doesn't have to look that beautiful. And with our button, we're going to go to the advanced properties and we're going to choose the onSelect property, which again is set to false. So if you're testing it, nothing happens. We want to use the same navigate property. Navigate, in this case, we want to send them to the home screen. And we are going to use the opposite transition. So we use transition, screen transition cover. We're going to use screen transition cover right. This will just kind of change the direction that the user feels like they're moving in. And so now we've already submitted a form. We have been taken to the success screen, and now we want to submit another request. So this is a good learning opportunity. We have been taken to the right screen, but we don't see our form. And the reason is that that was originally a new form and the data was submitted with it, but it was never reset. So when the user comes back to the form's like, hey, we're gone. This is supposed to be a new form because that's how we declared it in the default mode. And it was a new form that was filled out and then submitted. So now we don't know what to display because nobody's told us to reset. And so what I like to do within the form, again, in the onSuccess property where we are navigating folks, I want to add another piece of logic. So again, if you add a semicolon and come down, there is a reset form property. It's going to say, what form do you want to reset? I want to reset form 1. And so not only will this then navigate to the success screen if it's submitted successfully, it'll also reset the form, which will make it a new form again. So we have that reset functionality hooked up. Let's give it another test. So now when you play, it's a new form. This is a test event. Lorem ipsum. We're going to make this for March 27th at 9 o'clock. And it's an anniversary party, which means the dress code's not required. And we'll just provide guests, even though we don't have to. 50 of them. Now we are correctly taken to our success screen. And then if we submit another request or taken to the original screen, the form is new again. And that is thanks to us resetting the form when the form was initially submitted successfully. That wraps up the second and final part of our little mini series aimed at helping you create your very first Power Apps form. What we covered in this series is a lot of what I think you'll end up doing kind of day to day if you work in the Power Platform space and you have clients, or you yourself are a Microsoft user and you have access to things like SharePoint. Oftentimes it starts with building a data source, connecting it to your Power App, and then where things get really exciting is when you hook up your Power App to Power Automate. And that allows you to send emails to users. It allows you to do things like scan documents for information. And in future videos, we're going to delve further into Power Apps and also spend a lot more time talking about how Power Automate can be integrated into your Power Apps. So thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.